Good day, everyone. I'm Dominic Allain. I'm the Director for Global Health here in the Faculty of Medicine. Thanks for joining us today. I know everyone's got a busy schedule, and thank you to Dr. Sherilee Harper for joining us for this talk. That sounds really exciting. Just a little bit of background on Dr. Harper. So she's a Bachelor in Biology from Queen's University. She also has a Master's and a PhD from the University of Guelph in Epidemiology. Her PhD thesis focused on gastrointestinal illness in Canada's north and the implications of climate change on current and future health of Inuit people. For the past 3 years, she's been an associate professor and the Canada Research Chair in Climate Change and Health here at the U of A. Her research investigates associations between weather and Indigenous health in the context of climate change, and she collaborates with Indigenous partners to prioritize climate-related health actions, planning, interventions, and research. She's the co-lead of the Indigenous Health Adaptation to Climate Change, or the IHACC program, an international research initiative that works closely with Indigenous peoples and their organizations in the Canadian Arctic, and also the Ugandan impenetrable forest and the Peruvian Amazon. The program aims to utilize science and Indigenous knowledge to strengthen health systems in light of a rapidly changing climate within 3 areas: food security, malaria, and foodborne and waterborne diseases, all very important areas. So Dr. Harper, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see here. All right. Okay, hopefully you can see that. It's such a great pleasure to be here today. I'm joining you from Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, and I'm so happy to be talking about this topic of climate change and health, which is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart and something that is increasingly important today. So, you know, the topic of climate change and health has been getting increasing news coverage lately. So here's a couple of examples. I just looked these up, and these are some things that came up in the past couple of weeks. In the bottom corner here, in the bottom left, is a special report that came out from the World Health Organization just last week. And this report talks about climate change and health and the importance of considering that in the upcoming United Nations Climate Change COP, which will be the first 2 weeks of November, where major climate change negotiations will happen nationally. So pay attention in the news for that. There should be a lot of increasing coverage on that. But one of their main findings in the report, or a finding that they highlight, for example, is how every minute there are 13 deaths related to air pollution around the world. But if we were to reduce our emissions to meet the Paris Agreement targets, which is something that countries around the world have agreed to doing, that could decrease the number of air pollution related deaths by up to 80%. So it just shows that the positive health impacts that can happen with reducing emissions in response to climate change. Now, I think that you will see a lot of increased coverage of this year's climate change COP, where these major negotiations are happening, because recently the CDC indicated that they're going to increase their climate change coverage. So over here in sort of the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a story that CBC just posted yesterday talking about their renewed commitment to covering climate change topics in the Canadian context. And some people are saying that, you know, it's about time. Canada's been a little bit slow to get up to speed and to be where other countries are at in terms of their media coverage on climate change. But this new commitment from CDC is really promising. And one of the things that they outlined in their article yesterday is how they're going to be covering COP in a very serious way, which is great. So climate change is definitely a hot topic. There's lots of things happening in climate change right now. But one thing you might be wondering is how does climate change impact me, or how does climate change impact my health? And so what I would like to invite you to do as we go over the next slides, where I'll talk about how climate change has impacted health of people around the world, including each and every one of us, I'd like you to go to this Menti website, so just menti.com, and enter the code 57594740. And there's a question about how climate change has impacted you. So as I go through the slides and I talk about it, I want you to think and reflect on how climate change maybe has impacted you personally, or impacted your family or your friends or your neighbors, and just enter those in as we go through. And on each of my slides in the bottom corner, I'll have this Menti code. So if you didn't quite catch it there, no problem, it's on each slide. So, climate change impacts everything, the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink. And so it impacts many different facets of health. But today I'll just focus on 4 of them. One is how heat waves impact health, wildfires, food, and mental health. So heat waves, and this last summer was a doozy, and there were several heat waves and a lot of health related outcomes. And so this slide is a little busy, but the main point of this slide is to demonstrate all the different ways that heat waves can impact health. And that is everything from, heat stroke and heat stress to dehydration to chronic kidney disease, respiratory disease, asthma. Heat waves impacts all of these different health outcomes and exacerbates them and makes them worse. And there's been a lot of studies from around the world that have shown that during heat waves, these significantly increase. And we certainly saw in British Columbia last summer, for example, that increased number of deaths that were associated with those heat waves. But really importantly, those impacts vary by age and gender and location and different socioeconomic factors. So heat waves don't equitably impact everyone. They impact different people's health differently. And we know from the climate change science that heat waves have increased over the past 10 years. And we also know there's been increased attribution studies that specifically have linked these increases in heat waves specifically to climate change. So we know that we're seeing increased heat waves, and we know that those are a result of climate change, and we know that those are going to increase in the future. We know that those past heat waves have had serious impacts on people's health. And there's been some really interesting work that has been done to look at different climate change scenarios based on our level of emissions, what different warming futures might exist for us, and how the number of heat waves would look like under those different scenarios. So, for example, there's this one study that was done in Canada and in the United States, and this is a graph with the percentage of years with extreme heat waves and different decades along the bottom here. So you see here, this is under a lower emissions scenario. This is if we cut our emissions drastically to meet the Paris Agreement targets. We would see still an increase by 2040 in the number of extreme heat waves that we see. Under a high emissions scenario, we can see that increases a little bit. So under a high emissions scenario, by the year 2040, we'll see an even bigger increase. But what's more striking is that as you look across the century, that gap between a low emissions future and a high emissions future in terms of the number of heat waves that are expected, you can see it increases over time. So by the end of the century, this gap between the number of heat waves under a low emissions scenario and a high emissions scenario is quite different. And we know that under these different scenarios, the health impacts will be inequitable. So different populations will be at higher risk than others. But we also know that, under a low emissions scenario, our healthcare system can cope with this increase in heat waves and responding to that. But we also know that under a scenario like this, a high emissions scenario, where we're seeing a lot more increase in heat waves, that the health system is going to be very stressed to respond to that increase of heat waves. So the second example is wildfires. This is something that's probably very familiar to all of us. And again, this slide just has a lot of information, but the main thing is to point out how increased wildfires lead to different health outcomes. So obvious ones might be death, but there's also been studies that have found increased emergency room visits, some serious mental health impacts, and that includes mental health impacts from people being, evacuated, from being from seeing those wildfires destroying property and so on. There's been studies that have looked at how it increases burns and cardiovascular distress and different respiratory symptoms as well. There has been increasing research on this, not as much as exists for heat waves, but there's increasing research looking at how climate change in the past 2 decades has increased fire occurrence. It's increased the area burned, and it's increased the number of ignitions or new fires that have started. There has definitely been increased fires in Canada that have been specifically attributed to climate change. And there was one extensive study done in the United States that found about half of the annual area burned in the States is attributed to anthropogenic climate change. So we know that there has been an increase in the past in terms of wildfires related to climate change, and we know that that's going to increase in the future. And of course, this has been linked to health outcomes, and the research on this in terms of projections is really emerging. So we know that there will be increased wildfires in the future, but in terms of what the numbers will look like in terms of health impacts, that's a little more uncertain. And there's more research being published on this quite literally every month. The third area is food. Climate change impacts every step of our food system. So events like things like changing precipitation, so changes in rain and snow and flooding and drought, all these things impact our food system in terms of the food that's grown, in terms of different pathogens that can become contaminated from produce to livestock. That there's some really solid research that links different weather parameters to increase pathogen loads in different foods. And warmer temperatures also result in increased food spoilage. Things like ice storms or any storm really can interrupt the temperature control in the food system at grocery stores, or when it's being transported to grocery stores, or even in our home. So there's lots of different ways that climate change can increase the risk of foodborne disease. So as an example, especially in Western Canada, warming ocean waters have been associated with increased Vibrio species in water. And that can increase the risk of contamination of shellfish. And so we have seen over the past couple decades, the number of outbreaks in Western Canada has increased. And that's projected to continue to increase into the future because of ocean warming. But we also know that adaptation is a really important factor here, and public health programs are really important in terms of decreasing that risk. So as an example, one study that was done in Canada by the Public Health Agency of Canada found that enhanced surveillance and improved temperature control regulations can actually significantly reduce the risk that climate change poses to foodborne disease, for this example of oysters and Vibrio in British Columbia. And then the last one I wanted to talk about was mental health. And this is an emerging area of research that's getting a lot of attention by the general public and in the media. It's a really, really hot topic. And it's a hot topic because it cuts across all the different health outcomes or all the different pathways through which climate change impacts health. So, it doesn't matter whether you're the person who's experiencing the climate change hazard, like a wildfire, a heat wave, some sort of hurricane. All these things obviously impact your mental health when you're experiencing them, if you have to be evacuated, if you're worrying about being evacuated. But it also impacts, family members. If you have somebody who is in a situation where you're worried about whether or not they're going to have to be evacuated or impacted, but it impacts each and every one of us too. There's also increased research that's showing that even seeing the repeated climate hazards that we're increasingly seeing, day after day on the news. This summer it was the heat waves, and then it was forest fires, and then there was that serious flooding in Germany. That constant seeing of images and these disasters that have a climate change fingerprint in them is also linked to increased climate change anxiety and eco-grief and other mental health impacts. So those are the 4 different ways that I wanted to just sort of cover today. And now what I'd like to do is turn it over to Menti and to see what types of things you maybe reflected on as we went through those slides, to think about how climate change impacts you personally, or how it impacts your family or your friends. How has climate change impacted your health? So again, here's the Menti code if you haven't had a chance to do so. It's 57594740. And hopefully this will work. Yeah, we see some things coming up here. So climate change impacts my asthma, general anxiety, and existential dread for my future and the future of humanity. I think that a lot of people are feeling that way, for sure. Experiencing hotter temperatures, increasing food costs, and watching poor folks who have endured flooding, forest fires, and storms, certainly. I can definitely relate to that personally. Summers are not as enjoyable anymore. They're more brutal than relaxing. Heat waves with no air conditioning in homes, and the negative impact that has on everyone's ability to sleep, for sure. Feeling hopelessness about whether or not we can change the trajectory. That is an increasing area of research that people are starting to look at, how to address that and how to work on that. Fires in the summer and smoke, wildfires, yeah, it impacts our ability to get outside and do exercise, so it impacts our physical activity. It increases our exposure to infectious disease. Some more comments on the feeling of dread and kids not being able to enjoy nature because of heat waves or smoke, and just that inability to get outside during those events. And yeah, the feeling of other people who ignore what's happening, that can be really challenging too. Climate change communication, just like a lot of communication in the health sciences, can be really challenging and difficult. So thanks for taking a moment to fill those out and reflect on how climate change is impacting you personally. And I have to say that all the things that were shared here, there is evidence, like very, very, very clear evidence demonstrating that these things are happening at a much larger scale than just our group here today. And it does really underpin and underscore the importance of climate change action. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to talk about in our talk today was how this links to international policy arenas. So a lot of my own research is community-based, working with communities, mainly in the Arctic, but also in other areas on climate change topics. And so a question that I often get asked is, how does that research that happens at a very local level, how does that feed into international climate change discussions? And I think this is a particularly relevant question right now, considering that the UN's climate change COP is coming up just a couple of weeks away now, those first 2 weeks of November, where major negotiations will happen on climate change. The COPs are where things like the Kyoto Protocol was established, where the Paris Agreement was signed. And each year they have these negotiations to update and renew climate change agreements and commitments from countries. So what I wanted to do was use the IPCC as an example. I'm an author on different climate change, IPCC climate change reports. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a UN organization, and they produce climate change assessment reports. And these assessment reports actually underpin those climate change COPs. So when the different governments go to negotiate these climate change agreements, they've already agreed to the underlying science that's in these IPCC reports, and they are supposed to form the foundation for those climate change negotiations. So one example that I just wanted to work through was the IPCC report that was published in 2019. So just a couple of years ago now. And it was a special report that focused on the ocean and a cryosphere and a changing climate. And so the way the IPCC process works is that each country nominates different scientists to become authors on the IPCC report. So that's a competitive process where people apply to their government to be nominated. And then those nominations get put forward from the government to the IPCC. And then the IPCC goes through all those different applications and selects an author team. Thousands of people get nominated to the IPCC, and usually about 100 or 200 authors are on each report. And it's a really interesting group of authors because it includes like every single different like climate scientist you could imagine. So on this special report on oceans and cryosphere, I worked with like ocean chemists and marine biologists, anthropologists, economists. There was like every single different discipline you could possibly imagine where people dedicated their lives and their research to studying the climate change angle of that. So you have these different authors who come together and work together over a couple of years to produce this report. There are different lead author meetings along the way where you meet and discuss things and work on the report. But a really key part of it is this iterative draft process. So there are 3 different drafts. And for each draft, it goes out for open peer review. So anyone who has any science background or research experience can be a peer reviewer on these reports. And the IPCC authors have to respond to every single reviewer comment that is made. In addition to scientists who participate in the peer review process, all the UN member states also contribute to the process. So for instance, Government of Canada scientists also reviewed these reports and made extensive comments and feedback. Then at the end, a summary for policymakers is prepared, and that's a summary of the report. But then that summary for policymakers goes under a line-by-line approval, where all the different UN member states come together in a UN plenary. And you can see in the picture here, every single sentence gets reviewed and approved by the UN member states. And once the summary for policymakers is approved, that signals that the entire report has been signed off by all the different UN member states. And that's why these reports are so important for these international climate change negotiations that are coming up, because every single UN member state has agreed that this science is real, that what's in this report they have to make decisions on, and they're acknowledging that the importance and validity of it. So these reports are huge, and they will be, you'll notice in early November that they really do underpin a lot of the decisions that will be made at COP. So for this special report, we assessed almost 7,000 research articles. There were 104 different authors from 36 different countries. Almost a third were women, and there were over 30,000 reviewer comments, which is a lot. So this is a heavily, rigorously peer-reviewed document where every single comment has to be responded to. So this is sort of like, what people think of when they think of the IPCC. There are these like, graphs where we see in the first part of the graph what's happened to date, and then we see these different projections under different climate change scenarios. And so these, for the SROC report, the special report on oceans and changing cryosphere, that sort of translates into the temperature is increasing, oceans are warming, there's been ice sheet loss, sea ice is decreasing, permafrost is shrinking, and the sea level is rising. And those are all very biophysical impacts of climate change for the ocean and cryosphere. But these biophysical changes have consequences for nature and humanity that are sweeping and severe. And this was a major finding of that report. So then the question becomes, how does local research get filtered up into the report, other than just being cited? How do those individual research articles become main conclusions of the report? So to do that, I think it might be helpful to take a moment to imagine the context of the cryosphere and the ocean, or in this case, where I do a lot of my own research with Inuit communities in the Arctic. So imagine that you don't live, in Edmonton or wherever you might live, but imagine that you live somewhere in the Canadian Arctic. So you have on this map Inuvialuit, Nunavik, or Nunatsiavut. Imagine how the landscape is very different than it is here in Edmonton. In the Arctic, there's lots of open ocean waters, that separate really small rocky bodies of land. Imagine how remote the communities are. There are no roads going into or out of these communities. They're fly-in only. So imagine how that impacts your food system, having to have food flown in, like produce gets flown into the communities, supplies get flown into the communities. In the wintertime, those large bodies of water freeze over and the ice becomes your highway. It's how you access local hunting and fishing grounds. It's how you can, if you like, access other communities that are nearby. These frozen waterways provide really important transportation routes for the people who live there. And of course, Inuit are really well known for traditional dog sleds. And this is how people used to traditionally travel between communities or go to different hunting grounds or navigate over the land, snow, and ice in the winters. And they still do so today. In the summertime, which is very short, only a couple months of the year, those frozen waterways thaw, and now all of a sudden new places are accessible by boat. So new cabins or new fishing grounds, new places to get food are accessible by boat in the summertime. And you know, this always really strikes me. Imagine that the relationship that people have with the environment in the Arctic to survive. I mean, they've survived for generations and generations and generations in these Arctic conditions. And the only way that they've been able to survive in this really cold climate is through a really close relationship with the environment. And this includes food. And so sometimes people don't think about this very much, but in the Arctic, hunting and fishing and gathering isn't just something that people do for cultural continuity, which of course they do. It's critical for cultural continuity. But you know, hunting and fishing and gathering is also really critical for the food that they eat. It still contributes a really large proportion of their diet. So accessing hunting grounds and accessing different places to go fishing is really important for food security and critical for nutrition. So if you think about food having to be flown into communities, you can imagine the types of food that often gets flown into grocery stores. It's food with long shelf lives that often have low nutritional content and are highly processed. So the food that's available on the land is a lot healthier and is just loaded with micro and macronutrients compared to the types of food that are often available in the grocery stores. Drinking water is available like by tap in most communities for most households. But when people are out on the land, they have to collect water to drink. There's no taps at cottages that you can turn on the water. People collect that locally. And people have been reporting how climate change is already impacting the quality of drinking water, but also the quantity of drinking water. Places where people used to go to get drinking water, there's no drinking water there anymore. It's dried up, or the quality has really changed. It's a lot more turbid and a lot more particulate matter in it, making it unsafe to drink. And, you know, with climate change, Inuit have been observing this long before researchers, but, you know, Western researchers have confirmed this with instrumental data that the climate has been changing drastically in the Arctic and will continue to do so into the future. So things like impact on water safety is only going to get worse. You know, changing ice conditions and melting ice. It impacts people's ability to go hunting and fishing and gathering. So that impacts nutrition. It impacts people's mental health when they're stressed out in unsafe conditions or uncertain conditions that they didn't, you know, historically experience, but they're experiencing increasingly today. So all these things impact the environment and impact people's health. So, you know, when you think of the ocean and cryosphere, there are people who live in the Arctic. The Arctic isn't this barren place. There are people who live there and who have lived there since, you know, like time immemorial. So in the SROC report, there were a number of different health outcomes that were covered in the report, but I just wanted to focus in on two, and that's food security and nutrition. So one of the main food security findings that was in the summary for policymakers, which was line by line approved by all the different UN member states, was that food and water security have been negatively impacted by changes in snow cover, lake and river ice, and permafrost in many Arctic regions. These changes have disrupted access to and food availability within herding, hunting, fishing, and gathering areas, harming the livelihoods and cultural identity of Arctic residents, including Indigenous populations. So this was the concluding statement in the summary for policymakers, which is, you know, the document that underpins COP negotiations. And so this conclusion was based on a number of different studies, but I wanted to share a couple from the Arctic. So there was one study that was done in Nunatsiavut that talked about food security, and these are the voices of Inuit elders talking about how the ice is no longer safe or predictable, it's not stable, and people don't trust it. People talked about accidental death because of changes in ice conditions and weather conditions, and how people are out on the land jeopardizing their lives in these unstable elements. So it's not just instrumental Western science data that's informing these reports, it's also Indigenous knowledge systems. There was one study that was done in Alaska that looked at how if somebody reported having to make a change in their travel plans, how it was associated with an increased odds of hypothermia and frostbite. And when people reported unusual weather conditions that they were out in, that increased the odds of unintentional injury and death. And this was another source based on Indigenous knowledge in one study where they talked about how climate change has huge impacts on Inuit. This elder said, you just gotta live it to actually understand what we're feeling and what we're going through. And the pain that you see in elders' eyes when they know they can't hunt something that they've been hunting all their lives, and they can't pass on that knowledge because they're getting older and they're getting sicker. And they have to feel those traditions being taken away. So in this study, it was really focusing on the mental health impacts of these changes in the food system. And then finally, it's not just animals and meat that people are having trouble accessing. It's also, berries. And this elder talked about what it meant to her when there were no berries one summer. So last year we had no berries. And I mean, berries are almost a staple. They're so good for you and they're high in antioxidants, and there were none. And then, she ended by saying, to have that happen, and there was a long pause. And climate change doesn't just impact the food that's available on the land, it actually also impacts grocery store food availability too. So if there's a storm, or if plants can't get in or out of a community for whatever reason, which is happening increasingly because of climate change, that impacts the foods that's available on the shelves. And there were lots of stories in this one study about how that impacts the things that are available in grocery stores, and how oftentimes the grocery stores will be bare because of it. So the second example is nutrition. And so this was the concluding statement in the summary for policymakers that was agreed on by the UN member states. And it's that increases in the risk for seafood security are associated with decreases in seafood availability, and this is projected to elevate the risk of nutritional health in some communities who are highly dependent on seafood, including those in the Arctic, West Africa, and small island developing states. So this is an example of a really great group of articles that was from some research that was done with BC First Nations communities on the coast. And so for these communities, seafood is a really critical part of their diet. It provides really important nutrients and is a staple. And so with this, what one part of this series of studies did is they looked at climate change projections, and they said, okay, we know that climate change is warming the ocean waters. We've done projections on how this is going to change seafood availability. It impacts where fish are, it impacts how big fish are, it impacts what type of fish are available, it impacts how far you have to go to get those fish. There was all that natural science done on how climate change is already impacting and is projected to continue to impact seafood that's available for those communities. And so based on what these communities were eating in terms of seafood and the important components of the diet that it provided for those community members, under a low emission scenario where we meet the Paris Agreement targets, it's projected that these communities would still see about a 21% decrease in nutritional intake because of that loss of seafood. Under a high emission scenario, where we continue on the pathway that we're on right now, and we continue almost as business as usual, we would see a 32% decrease in nutritional intake for these communities. But what was really critical in one of the series of these articles was that they also looked at adaptation strategies. So if the seafood's no longer available, what other options are available to the communities to replace that food? So there are things like chicken or canned tuna. There's a whole list of different food sources that were considered in this study, but they found that even substituting their seafood intake with these non-traditional foods would not replace the nutrients lost due to climate change. And that really speaks to the importance of traditional food sources, especially for Indigenous communities, and how they're irreplaceable from cultural perspectives, but also from a health and wellness and nutritional perspective as well. So those are two examples of the different health impacts that were covered in this report. But there are a number of other health impacts that were covered. And this way of feeding research up into the report and into the underlying chapters of the report, and then that gets fed up into the summary for policymakers. And that summary for policymakers is what these international COP negotiations are based on. And so as we lead into the COP, and as you hear news coverage about the negotiations that are taking place and happening, now you'll know the science that underpins that, and how even community-based research at small local scales can influence that international policy. And I think with that, it's going to continue to increase in the future. But I'll stop there and thank you. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions now or later. Yeah.